So this unit starts in 1450, which is called the early modern era. During this time, people generally believed that the Earth was the center of the universe. Everything else, including the sun, revolved around the Earth. And this view hadn't changed much since the classical period. Aristotle, remember one of the most important Greek philosophers, believed that there were spheres that surrounded the Earth, and these spheres were made up of a sort of fifth element, something that didn't exist on Earth, and stars and planets were embedded in these spheres that surrounded the Earth. Later philosophers built on this idea, but this was essentially the same way people viewed the Earth 2,000 years later in Western Europe. So in the Middle Ages, the spheres of Aristotle still existed, and they still circled the Earth. The moon was in the first sphere, followed by Mercury in the next sphere, followed by Venus, then the sun, Mars, Jupiter, and finally Saturn. This idea that the Earth is at the center of the world is called the Geocentric Model. Geo for Earth, geo at the center of the cosmos. And this idea that the Earth was at the center of the cosmos worked well with the teachings of the Catholic Church, because it turned the attention of the entire universe on Earth, looking in on Earth. And the Catholic Church taught that it was angels that guided the spheres, and God sat atop and watched over these spheres. The geocentric model, the idea that the Earth is at the center of the universe, was challenged by a Polish astronomer named Nicholas Copernicus. And Copernicus made the argument that, in fact, the Earth wasn't the center of the universe. Instead, the sun was at the center of everything, and the Earth actually revolved around the sun. This in turn meant that the Earth wasn't necessarily unique from other planets, and maybe not the center of God's attention. Other astronomers followed in the footsteps of Copernicus. So we have Johann Kepler and Tycho Brahe, and they showed that planets didn't rotate in perfect circles. Rather, they orbited in sort of elliptical orbits. It had always been assumed that anything outside of the Earth was a heavenly body, and these heavenly bodies were perfection. So the idea that they didn't rotate in perfect circles challenged this idea of perfection. This idea of perfection is also challenged by the Italian astronomer Galileo Galilei. So Galileo he's most well known for pioneering the use of the telescope to observe the night sky. So he observed that the sun was actually covered in sunspots, so there were these blemishes across the surface of the sun, so like what Kepler and Brahe observed with the elliptical orbits, this challenged the idea that the heavenly bodies were perfect. Galileo is also a supporter of Copernicus's ideas. He believed that the sun was at the center of everything, and the Earth rotated around the sun, and this got him in a lot of trouble. He was eventually imprisoned, and he was forced to renounce his ideas. With these astronomers, we began to see a shift to a more scientific approach to observing the natural world. And really between the 15 and 1700s, we see sort of a shift towards a more scientific approach to the world. And you'll hear the term scientific revolution. This is really a broad term for both the advancements that were made in science and technology during the early modern period, but also a change in attitude towards how we acquire new information, how we acquire knowledge. And scientists developed what we now refer to as the scientific method. That's applying the practices of scientific observation to their research. And one of the first people to really define the scientific method was the English philosopher Francis Bacon. And Bacon argued that to discover new knowledge, to discover something new, one had to first observe a natural occurrence, and from that observation, one had to collect data. Further experiments were needed to collect better data, and then once that data was collected, you could draw conclusions and create principles. And very important, you had to recreate the experiments and test the principles to see if they're accurate. So in essence, if something is to be true, then it needs to be observed in the natural world. And other philosophers around this time echoed the view. A French philosopher, René Descartes, in his work Discourse on Method, argued that all things needed to be confirmed through careful observations. If it can't be observed, then it should be doubted. And Descartes is most famous for saying that the only thing he could be really sure of was his own existence, because he could think, and thinking proved his existence to himself. So you get the adage, I think, therefore I am. And finally, we get Sir Isaac Newton, and he helped develop the laws of gravity. But what was really radical about his ideas on gravity is the idea that the moon and the planets that orbited the sun obeyed the laws of gravity similar to gravity on Earth. So the falling of an apple from a tree obeyed the same laws as the planets and the stars. And this really conflicted with the dominant religious view at the time that the celestial bodies were part of the heavens and were not subject to the same laws as Earth was. So it's understandable that a lot of this new learning was criticized by the Catholic Church. Both its teachings and its authority were being attacked. Galileo was forced to renounce his ideas. There were cases where scientists and philosophers were burned at the stake for being heretics. The interesting thing is that none of these early scientists, not Galileo or Bacon or Newton, none of them rejected Christianity. Galileo always claimed that his scientific ideas were entirely compatible with the Bible. Isaac Newton was a devout Christian, and he studied the Bible as a scholar and didn't see any contradiction between religion and science. A lot of these scientists, including Newton, their worldview could be described as deism. And an analogy for deism is that God is like a watchmaker, and God created the world with all its inner workings and parts in place, and after this, God let the world run without any intervention of any kind. So God is not a personal God that interferes in everyday affairs, but more of a detached creator who's more of a disinterested observer, someone who set everything in motion. By the time of Isaac Newton's death, the view of the physical universe had been forever changed. So educated people no longer believed that the universe was propelled by angels and spirits, but rather that it functioned according to its own principles, and these principles could be understood through observation and through science. So the world regulated itself. It had less of a use for angels and for religion. Human beings were extremely intelligent, and they had the gift of reason and were capable of understanding the world using reason alone. So this move to a more scientific approach first happened in disciplines that we consider to be more scientific, like astronomy or physics. But as the ideas of the scientific revolution became more widespread across Europe, philosophers and thinkers in a wide variety of disciplines liked the idea that a move to a more scientific approach to everything in life would result in a general enlightenment of society. And the term the Enlightenment would come to define the 18th century in European history. So the basic theme of the Enlightenment is human progress and the power of human knowledge to transform society, make the world a better place. I guess the central ideas of the Enlightenment was that human science and reason, not religion, would provide order for Europe. And it's important to consider historical context as well. So very recently, like we looked at in the first part of the podcast, we're coming off deadly wars between Protestants and Catholics, the French Wars of Religion and the 30 Years' War. So the assumption was that if human reason could understand very complex laws of the universe, then it should not be too hard to discover ways for humans to govern themselves more effectively. So the Enlightenment, again, the general term Enlightenment really describes the movement. This movement was really about doing away with the established order in exchange for progress. So the principles of the Enlightenment are things like open-mindedness, criticism, questioning, especially questioning of established political and religious institutions. So Enlightenment thinkers really took aim at some long-held ideas, the idea that kings had a divine right to rule, for example. And the ideas that developed during the Enlightenment really inspired the revolutions that we're going to look at in Unit 4, including the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and the Haitian and Latin American revolutions. So you'll read some primary documents written by some of these Enlightenment thinkers, and I'm just going to conclude by speaking about two of them. The first I want to speak briefly about is John Locke, who is a British political thinker. And if you take an introduction to political studies or political ideology next year in your first year of university, you probably study some of the works of John Locke. And that's because Locke is considered to be the father of the political ideology of liberalism. So, at the center of Locke's ideology or philosophy is the idea that government is something that's created by man or created by humans and not divine. Really, the government should be seen as a contract between rulers and the ruled. Rulers should not be able to pass on their thrones to their children. Since the power of a ruler came from the people they ruled and not from God, the ruler's power should be limited and people should have the right to take power away from the ruler. So, really returning to these ideas of democracy. Also, Locke argued that because government is a human creation, not a divine creation, there needed to be a separation from church and state. So, that idea of separation of church and state, Locke argued for a secular society where people were free to practice any religion they wanted. So we'll see how these ideas become influential down the road. The other Enlightenment philosopher I just wanted to touch upon was a French philosopher named Voltaire, and Voltaire criticized a wide range of social injustices. Voltaire argued that God had created natural laws to guide human behavior, and evil arose in society when natural laws were broken, and it was humankind's duty to rediscover these natural laws through the use of reason. So I'm going to end the podcast here, and you're going to explore some of these Enlightenment thinkers in more detail through primary documents. So thank you for listening.